Corinthians chapter 10. We're still in a section dealing with Christian liberty. And chapter 9 we noticed that liberty was not to be used to hinder the preaching of the gospel. In fact, Paul said, look, it's a command, actually. It's ordained of God that those apostles and preachers of the first century live of the gospel, and that their families be supported as well. And so if an apostle or a preacher or prophet in the first century took that support, then he was free to do so. But Paul said, I was also free not to take it. Paul did actually take support from one particular congregation. Who was that? Where did he get his support? Yeah, the church at Philippi, you recall, supported Paul and his work. But by and large, Paul supported himself, but he did that for various reasons, which he explains in the second part of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And then in chapter 10, he's going to discuss how that liberty, Christian liberty, is not an occasion or cannot be an occasion for apostasy or to fellowship error, and also give some more principles toward the end of the chapter regarding the exercise of our liberty. You'll notice at the end of chapter, really if you recall at the end of chapter 9, he mentioned that even an apostle, he said he disciplined his body, brought it into subjection lest when he had preached to others, he might become disqualified. So he points out the fact that even an apostle could go into apostasy. So now he's going to warn these people in general and remind them of the Israelites as they came out of Egypt. So let's look at these first 5 verses. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you, and remember, of course, when this letter was written, there were no chapters and no verse numbers. So this all is a continuation. He said, lest I become disqualified. Moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. But with most of them God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Well, he says, I would not want you to be, I think the King James says ignorant, but he says in the New King James, unaware. Why might these particular Christians be unaware of what happened to the Israelites of old? Why might they be unaware? Exactly. Being Gentiles, they might not have been familiar at all with the Old Testament accounts of God's people. And so Paul says, I don't want you to be ignorant of this, but here's an example for you. You might not know the full history of Israel, but you need to understand the covenant relationship that existed between God and His people of that day. It might help you understand your relationship with Him and the fact that you can, just like they did, rebel and turn your back on Him. And so he says, all our fathers, he's talking, of course, that all our fathers, that is, the ancestors of the Jews, but keep this in mind, even though he may be referring to fleshly fathers, there is a sense in which, according to Romans 4:11, Abraham is the father of who? Not just of fleshly Jews, but who? All the faithful, all them that believe, Paul said in Romans 4:11. And in fact, in Galatians 6:16, the church is called the Israel of God. And so we sometimes, in fact, a lot of times refer to Abraham as the father of the faithful, and that would include any testament or covenant. And this cloud, of course, symbolizing the blessings and benefits that God showered upon His people as He guided them from Egypt. But notice the comparisons here. He says they were all baptized. You had the cloud above them, the ground below them, the sea on each side of them as they passed through the sea. And we know that this Greek word baptizo, it's just transliterated into English. It's not really translated like it should have been in our English Bibles. If it were translated, our English Bibles would say, "Go ye and teach all nations," doing what? Immersing them, dipping them, plunging them, submerging them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Then, you wouldn't have all these arguments, or at least hopefully you wouldn't have as many arguments about, well, what is the mode of baptism? Well, there is no question about what is the mode. There's only one mode, because that's what the word means. It's not a matter of can I sprinkle or pour. That's not even part of the word. There are other Greek words for those actions. If this word means to immerse, dip, or plunge, it's an overwhelming, a submersion. So he uses these types, and we're familiar with types and shadows. In fact, the Old Testament is inundated with them. They prefigure the spiritual realm of the New Testament and of Christ and His work. So when we analyze this event and these events of Moses leading the children of Israel to the Promised Land, we generally, if you did this in Vacation Bible School when you were a child, then you know that Egypt represents what? What is Egypt? What were these people leaving? What were they trying to get out of? What did you get out of? What did you leave? Huh? Sin, the world, or sin. Who was Pharaoh? Who's Pharaoh? Who does he represent? Pharaoh, huh? Who does he represent? Who's he a type of? Pharaoh. Satan, yeah. Remember, Pharaoh looked right at Moses and asked him this stupid question. Who is the Lord that I should obey Him? Who is the Lord that I should obey Him? So, he pursues Israel to try to keep them from leaving their old life and entering a new one. But they're baptized in the Red Sea. A rite of passage from one state to another. They were placed under the authority of Moses then. We're placed under the authority of Christ now. And we sometimes use the wilderness wandering as what? They wandered for 40 years after they were baptized. What does that represent? Yeah, our life on earth. It's a probationary period. That's what your life on earth is, a probationary period, to determine where you're going to end up. And then, of course, the crossing of the Jordan River. Well, there's old spirituals about that, right? What does the crossing of the Jordan River represent? Death. Represents death. And, of course, you enter the Promised Land, which is heaven. And so, types and shadows, we're familiar with those. I like what Willis said about this. All Israelites enjoyed the blessing of being baptized unto Moses. The significance of this is that their following the cloud and passing through the sea made them disciples of Moses. The cloud, remember the Pharisees on one occasion looked at Jesus and said what? We're disciples of Moses. We don't know about this guy. The cloud and the sea did for them in reference to Moses what baptism does for us in reference to Christ. It placed them under obligation to recognize His divine commission and submit to His authority. This Israelite baptism separated the Israelites from the bondage of Egypt, just as Christian baptism separates one from sin and brings one under the authority of Jesus Christ. Well, do you get the idea that perhaps, and we get the idea in this chapter, that some of these Christians might have thought, well, once I'm baptized, what? Well, that's it. I'm good to go, right? Once saved, always saved. What about the Israelites? Did that work for them? It's interesting. Notice the blessings that they received. First he says, all our fathers were under the cloud. All, notice the emphasis here, all passed through the sea. All were baptized unto Moses and in the cloud and in the sea. Now, they all ate the same spiritual food or drink. And there could be several ideas here. Is it physical? Is it spiritual? Is there some reference here to the Lord's Supper? Maybe. Is it just the spiritual food we receive as we study and grow? But nevertheless, notice they all received those spiritual benefits. They all drank the same spiritual drink, and they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ, by the way. The angel of Jehovah, the messenger of Jehovah, the one that spoke to Moses in from that bush, the one that led them through the wilderness, the one that appeared to Joshua with a sword in his hand, the one that appeared to David on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. All of those appearances of the messenger of Jehovah in the Old Testament, that is the pre-incarnate Christ. And so they got all these spiritual benefits, but notice the word all. But then you get this big contrast in verse 5, right? What's the contrast? But with many of them, Connie said most. Well, she's probably right. How many of them made it 20 years old and up? No, that's not true. Excluding the Levites, we'll leave them out. How many of the men of the age of war made it into the promised land? Joshua and Caleb. So, they all were baptized. They all received all these spiritual blessings and benefits. But with many of them, or most of them, the New King James says, God was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. So, yeah, they obeyed initially, but they didn't make it. So, what's he trying to tell these folks here in Corinth? Well, he tells you what he's trying to tell them. Look at verse 6. Now these things became our what? Types. That's the Greek word there. Prototype, pattern, example. That's why the Old Testament is so valuable. Romans 15:4, the things that were written aforetime were what? Written for our learning. Now these things became our examples to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. And do not become idolaters as were some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Nor let us commit sexual immorality as some of them did, and in one day 23,000 fell. Nor let us tempt Christ as some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents. Who'd they tempt, by the way? Who were they tempting back there in the Old Testament? What did I just tell you earlier? Christ. As some of them also tempted and were destroyed by serpents, nor complain, murmur, grumble, as some of them also complained and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. That word for type there means something which you strike, make an impression by striking a blow. So he says, well, Corinthians, here's a few examples for you from the Old Testament. Lust, strong desire, right? Really, lust is a strong desire for anything and can be used in a good sense or an evil sense. Here, obviously used in an evil sense. And then he quotes from Exodus chapter 32. What happened in Exodus chapter 32? Moses goes up to get the Ten Commandments. He's up there for 40 days. And these people have no patience at all. I mean, 40 days, he's gone. What are we going to do now? We're going to create our own gods. These are the gods that led you. In fact, Aaron even calls him, after he makes the calf, he says, we're going to worship the Lord. They may have thought, they were doing something okay. But as part of this worship to this golden calf in Exodus 32, 1 through 6, if you go back there, it'll say that they were singing and leaping, dancing. I think even the end of the chapter there in Exodus 32 talks about them being naked. But obviously the idol worship of the pagans always included some kind of licentious behavior. And so that was the same way during their time. So don't lust after evil things as they did, and do not become idolaters. Obviously, these Corinthians thought, and we've been talking about this through this whole thing, these meat sacrificed to idols, they obviously thought they were strong enough to visit these idols' temples and to be engaged in some of these activities, and that would not affect them spiritually. It would not affect their relationship with God. That they could be around these feasts and all the licentiousness that went with it. I mean, after all, remember we talked about the temple there in Corinth with its 1,000 temple prostitutes, because that's what idolatrous worship involved in those days. And if you're going to be around them, you're going to start thinking like that and become influenced to be more like its participants. They might not have thought it was a big deal, but maybe the Israelites didn't either. Neither let us commit fornication or sexual immorality, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 fell. Now that's a reference to Numbers 25. It's interesting in Numbers 25. This is one of those passages you sometimes read about in connection with Christian evidences. There are atheists, of course, that produce tons of books on alleged Bible contradictions, and most of them are so ridiculously stupid. I mean, I've read a lot of them, because they don't treat the Bible like any other book. They don't attempt to learn the context. They just pick something and say, oh, well, see, this is a contradiction. It doesn't make any sense. This is one of those sometimes they like to use, because if you go back to Numbers chapter 25, that is in connection with who? What event? What false prophet that got them into trouble? Who did Balak call? Balaam. Balak calls Balaam and says, I want you to curse the children of Israel. And Balaam, is told not to go, but he goes anyway. And the messenger of Jehovah, second member of the Godhead, appears to him on the road and would have killed him except for his donkey could see him. And then Christ has the donkey talking to him. So he shows up and he ends up blessing the children of Israel because he's inspired and he has no choice but to bless them. But we find out later that in other passages that this whole event where they committed fornication with the women of Moab or the Midianites was also because it was at Balaam, it was his idea. In other words, I had to bless them, right? I didn't have any choice. But then he tells Balak, the king there, look, if you want to get these people in trouble, you've got to separate them from God. You've got to put a wedge between them and God. The way you do that is you entice them, and that's what they did. So, you find out in that chapter that 24,000 died in the plague. And here it says 23,000. So this is one of those cheap and easy biblical contradictions, right? But what does the text say here? How many died? 23,000 what? Yeah, it actually modifies the number. 23,000 in one day. They don't tell us how long that the 24,000 died in Numbers, but go over to Numbers chapter 25. If you'll notice there, Israel, the people beginning of chapter 25, the people began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. Now, see, you don't know that Balaam's behind that till later in the book. And also, there's some passages in the New Testament. They invited the people to sacrifice to their God. The people ate, bowed down to their God. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against them. And so the Lord said to Moses, take all the leaders of the people and hang the offenders before the Lord out in the sun, that the fierce anger of the Lord may turn away from Israel. So Moses said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men who were joined to Baal of Peor. Well, then it goes through this episode of the man bringing the woman into camp, and Eleazar kills them. And so that stops the plague. And then it proceeds to tell us in verse 9, those who died in the plague were 24,000. But it doesn't tell us how many died on one day. The Jewish tradition ascribes 1,000 deaths back up to verses 4 and 5. When Moses told the leaders, take the leaders of the people and hang them, and he said to the judges of Israel, every one of you kill his men were joined to Baal. So, not a big deal there. You can't prove a contradiction unless there's actually one, and so for all we know, 23,000 died one day, but 1,000 died on another day. Yeah.
And that's, they apply different rules to the Bible than they would.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Something like the Battle of Gettysburg, and they might say, yeah, the Battle of Gettysburg lasted for 3 days.
3 days, yeah.
And in one day, 18,000 troops died in a single day. We do it today all the time.
Well, the funny thing, and I've done a lot of reading on these contradictions, usually what they never take into consideration, they just don't treat the Bible as normal speech. They don't take into consideration, for instance, figures of speech, like we use on a daily basis. It's really ridiculous. But nevertheless, if you don't want to believe something, you're not going to believe it. And so at any rate, there's just this little nugget here about 23,000 dying in one day. So you've got these Corinthians who I guess are advocating we can go to these feasts, we can be surrounded by these prostitutes and sexual immorality. In other words, it's the same idea today. How close to sin can I get without it affecting me or affecting my soul or my salvation? But notice he says, neither let us tempt Christ. What does that mean, that word tempt? What does it mean to tempt God? Test, make trial of. Sometimes God will test men or man to find out what? Whether he'll obey or not. He did that with Abraham. Sometimes it's to, strengthen him. But when men test or tempt God, it is really only for one purpose. And that is for finding out if he will really keep his promises. Will God really do what he says he's going to do? And that's one thing God will not tolerate, because he always does what he says he's going to do. And so he says you can't be doing that. You can't test God to see if he really means it. Is he going to still provide grace for you when you go beyond the limits that he set? It's this attitude of daring God to do something. One time in the Old Testament, God actually told an evil king to give him a test in Isaiah chapter 7. And that guy refused. He said, look, ask for me a sign and I'll give it to you. Well, that's okay. Whatever God asks or says do or don't do, we're supposed to do or not do. And so if he says, don't test me, don't test him. But if he says, well, look, I'll give you a sign this time, then take it. He feigned some piety, this king, and said, I'm not going to test you. And God said, well, I'll tell you what. A virgin will conceive and bear a son. His name will be called Emmanuel. And before he learns the good from the bad, then these two kings that you're worried about will be long gone in history. So then he gives this example here of Numbers 21, 4 through 9. What happened there? They were destroyed by what? Remember the brass serpent? And if you wanted to be saved, you had to do what? He had to look at it. Well, what was their sin on that occasion? He tells you. As some of them also tempted, they tested God. Well, how did they test Him? When they complained, when they grumbled, when they murmured, what were they saying? Yeah, I mean, if you go back and read, and we're not going to go back and read the section in Numbers 21, but if you go back and read it, they say things like, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? Really? You think God planned all along to get you out of Egypt so He could murder you? For there's no bread or water. Well, that's not true either, because then they go on to say, our soul loathes this light bread. We're tired of eating the same thing. They're questioning whether He will take care of them or not. And He was tired of hearing that. And so He sends these serpents among them. And many of them died on that occasion. And so, again, this dissatisfaction, this rebellious spirit, Philippians 2:14, do all things without murmurings and disputings. It's a terrible attitude to question whether He'll take care of me or not. Now, all of these things happen to them as examples, types. Well, what does it tell me? It tells me God rewards those who are faithful, punishes those who rebel against Him. Right? And they were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. This is it. Therefore, or wherefore, let him who thinks he stands. Well, you're pretty arrogant, Corinthians, some of you. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man, but God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make the way of escape, that you may be able to bear it. And He's not just talking about temptation to sin here, but He's talking about trials and tests of life. In fact, in this context, the way he words it, no temptation has overtaken you such as is common to man, that tells me that some of them were thinking what? If he has to tell me that no trial or test has come upon me that's not common to man, what does that tell me that my attitude's probably been? You see this all the time with people. We see it in the Bible. What? I'm the only one this has ever happened to. You know, my life, it's the worst. Why does this always happen to me? Doesn't happen to anybody else. Bad things happen to people. It's the world in which we live. And so to get the idea that I'm the only one that's ever gone through something, then you better know you're close to apostasy. And people do it all the time. Bad things don't go my way, I just leave God. He's not taking care of me. How do you know what God's doing behind the scenes? He's already promised that He'll take care of you. He'll take care of me. But, I'm the only one. There's a prescription for that. God gave it to Elijah. What did Elijah say? What did he tell God? After he had that great victory, man, he was on the spiritual mountaintop. The fire came down from heaven and destroyed the sacrifice. And then they took those prophets of Baal down to the river and killed them all. And then he gets a message from one woman, one mean woman, that says, by this time tomorrow, you're going to be in the same shape they are. And he ran. And he ran for days, and he ran all the way to Mount Sinai over a number of days. And when he gets there, God says, what are you doing here? And what does he say? I'm the only one. I'm the only one that's faithful. And God said, well, first of all, I've got 7,000 in Israel that have not bowed the knee to Baal. But Elijah, get up, and I got stuff for you to do. That's all he said. He said, get up. You got stuff to do. That seemed to cure his depression. He said, you go get Elisha. He's going to take your place. You go up to Syria. You anoint Hazael as king of Syria, and you do all this, and you got stuff to do before your time is through. But, Elisha was feeling the same way. But no temptation's overtaken you such as is common to man, whether it's temptation to sin or some trial or test of some sort. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you're able, but with the temptation will make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it, you may be able to endure it or bear up under. So, we have to be looking for that way of escape. We have to stay dedicated to Him. But too many times we're willing to throw in the towel rather than have the faith that we ought to in Him. The Lord knows how to deliver the godly out of temptation, 2 Peter 2:9. The Lord is faithful, who shall establish you and keep you from evil, 2 Thessalonians 3:3. Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation, Matthew 26. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, Hebrews 13:5. God says there's no excuse for unfaithfulness to me. I am always faithful to you. When Jesus was tempted to sin in Matthew 4, how did He respond? Yeah, He responded with the Word of God, did He not? There's all kinds of ways to respond to temptation to sin, and depending on the circumstance, it may require a different response. In Jesus' case, in meeting the devil head on, He responded with Scripture. Sometimes we need to do what Joseph did. What did he do? He ran. He fled. He just got out of the situation. But there's always a way of escape. That example of Joseph, of course, goes well with the next section. Therefore, my beloved, what? Flee from idolatry, the worship of idols. Flee from it. I speak as to wise men. Judge for yourselves what I say. Well, I think you people are smart enough to understand what I'm saying and apply it. Prudent, sensible, able to discriminate, distinguish, and select and choose correctly. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? For we, though many, are one bread and one body, for we all partake of that one bread. Well, communion, of course, means what? Koinonia is that word that's used there. Fellowship, association, joint participation, a sharer. The word blessing basically means to speak well, but the Jews modified it to mean to call down God's gracious power upon that object which is consecrated for a particular use. So the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a joint participation, a sharing, a fellowship of the blood of Christ? Well, what's the point? Let's read the next section and I think you'll see the context. Observe Israel after the flesh. Are not those who eat of the sacrifices partakers of the altar? When they offered sacrifices in the Old Testament, who shared in the sacrifices? There were three persons that got a part of the sacrifice. Who were they? Somebody already said one. The priest got part of it. Who else got some of it? Well, the one who brought it, and God got it. So, there was a joint participation, a sharing, a communion there. What am I saying then? That an idol is anything, or what is offered to idols is the same? Look, Paul says, I understand some of you, and there's several of you in the Corinthian church understand an idol is not anything, and there's no such thing as these gods. But that the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. And I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. But that altar, that sacrifice that they do, does represent something. It represents the fact that they have some participation with Satan, with the devil. You're either with God or you're not. And so these sacrifices they're offering, I realize there's no such thing as these false gods, but they are participating with demons, the world of evil spirits and Satan. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the Lord's table and of the table of demons. Or do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? So here you go. In the Old Testament, you had this joint participation with God and the priests and the person offering the sacrifice on the altar. When we partake of the Lord's Supper, there is a joint participation and a sharing between us and the Lord. He said, now you can't go to these temples of these idols and participate in these activities. Even though those gods are nothing and don't mean anything, the activities that you're participating in do mean something. And you can't be involved in it. And by the way, are we one bread and one body? It's not talking about just eating. We've got to have one loaf of bread here. It's not the point that he's making. But we partake of the Lord's Supper, and we share together, and we're united in fellowship with Him. And the only conditions, of course, is that we must be Christians and that we take it in a worthy manner. But the body is unified. Individuals that are unified because they partake of the same sacrifice through this bread. And so you're going to have this unity with these false gods, he says, if you go to these temples and also engage in that. We the many were one body. So, and we're the true Israel of today, right? As we've already said in Galatians chapter 6. Looking at these sacrifices, it was the same way in the Old Testament. And so the Corinthians are arguing, look, this is not a big deal. We're just eating a feast at a temple. And he says, look, you may not intend it to be, but you're engaged in false worship. And it is a big deal. And you're becoming partakers of it. So you need to stay away from it. Because it's going to lead you down the wrong path. You either serve God or Satan. You can't be part of two religious organizations at the same time. Do we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than He? Do you really want to irritate God to the point you make Him angry? You think you'd be able to withstand Him? Is that your goal? Think about this for a minute. The scriptures in Ephesians 5 describe the church as what? What are we in Ephesians 5? Church is described as a lot of things, but in Ephesians 5 it's described as what? We'll end on this note. The bride. You go back to Hosea and other places in the Old Testament, Israel of old was described as what? To God. Same thing, His wife. And when His wife, Israel of old, went worshiping other gods, He said, you're being unfaithful. You're acting like a whore. Basically what He said. You're unfaithful. And it's the same thing for us. We're the bride of Christ. Do we want to provoke Him to jealousy? Is that what we're trying to do? When He becomes angry enough to punish, do we think we'll be able to withstand it? I think to ask the questions to answer it, right? At least that's what Paul meant for us to do. We don't want to be that unfaithful wife or the one that flirts with unfaithfulness as these people were doing. Well, it's time for the bell. I don't know where our bell ringers are, but Eddie's going to ring the bell, even though I'm sure it's not his responsibility. All right, we'll pick up in verse 23 next week.